Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the quiet stone halls of medieval Europe. The candles are flickering low, the wind hums softly against the monastery walls, and somewhere in the distance a bell tolls for the evening prayer. So, before we begin, if you haven't already, pull the blankets a little closer, dim the screen brightness, and let the world fade away for a while. And of course, if you enjoy these sleepy journeys through the stranger corners of history, feel free to subscribe, like, or whisper a comment to the algorithmic spirits who haunt the recommendation feed. Now then, let's drift back nearly 1,000 years to a time when the holiest people in Europe were quietly losing their minds. The quiet madness of the cloister. For centuries, monasteries were supposed to be sanctuaries of peace, safe havens where men could flee the chaos of the world, abandon temptation, and dedicate their lives entirely to prayer, silence, and obedience. In practice, they were more like pressure cookers filled with human anxiety. The rules were strict, painfully so. The Benedictine rule, one of the most famous, demanded absolute silence for most of the day. No idle chatter, no laughter, no gossip about the weather or who stole the last piece of bread. Imagine living with the same 20 men for 30 years and never being allowed to complain about them out loud. If you've ever shared a flat with roommates, you know that's a fast track to madness. But for monks, silence was meant to purify the soul. Unfortunately, it also gave intrusive thoughts unlimited real estate. The gift of isolation. Many monks lived in what we might call religious lockdown. Some monasteries were almost completely cut off from the outside world. Letters were rare, visitors even rarer, and the longer a man stayed inside, the less he remembered how normal people actually behaved. There's a record from the 12th century of a monk who'd been in isolation for decades. When a visitor finally entered his cell, the man screamed, "A demon!" Because of course he hadn't seen a stranger in 20 years. It wasn't uncommon for monks to start hearing voices, divine or otherwise. Some claimed to see angels, others saw devils, and a few, like the unfortunate Brother Gerbert of Normandy, began conversing with the furniture. His abbot, according to the Chronicle, commended his zeal, but also recommended more sleep. Naturally, that didn't help. Sleep in monasteries wasn't exactly restful. The joyless sleep schedule. Most monasteries followed something called the canonical hours. That meant monks had to wake up several times a night to pray. The first prayer, matins, usually began sometime around 2 or 3 a.m., right in the middle of a good dream, of course. They'd shuffle into the cold, chant psalms for an hour or two, and then go back to bed, only to wake up again before sunrise for lauds. This sleep torture continued every single night. By modern standards, it was a surefire recipe for chronic sleep deprivation. And if you've ever stayed awake for 48 hours straight, you know what happens next. Everything starts feeling slightly unreal. But for monks, that feeling was mistaken for holiness. Hallucinating? You must be seeing divine visions, dizzy and incoherent. Surely that's the ecstasy of prayer. Centuries later, historians reading their diaries realized that many of those spiritual experiences sounded suspiciously like the symptoms of exhaustion, fasting, flagellation, and other terrible ideas. Of course, the medieval church never saw suffering as a bad thing. If something made you miserable, it was probably good for your soul. So monks fasted constantly, sometimes for days, sometimes on nothing but watery soup and bread so hard you could use it as a building material. A few took it further. There were monks who wore belts lined with sharp metal spikes. Others whipped themselves until they fainted. They called it mortification of the flesh. Modern medicine might call it mass malnutrition with bonus trauma. One poor man, recorded in the Chronicles of St. Peter's Abbey, spent an entire winter wearing a shirt made of horsehair. He developed an infection so severe that the other monks had to drag him, delirious and raving, to the infirmary. The abbot wrote in his journal that it was a blessed trial, which is, of course, one way to describe a life-threatening rash. The monastic diet, or lack thereof, food wasn't meant to be enjoyable. That was part of the problem. A typical monk's diet consisted of bread, beans, maybe a few vegetables, and the occasional fish, if you were lucky enough to live near water. Meat was banned, flavor was suspicious, and because refrigeration didn't exist, food poisoning was a recurring character in the monastic drama. Imagine living in a cold, damp building, eating spoiled fish on 2 hours of sleep, while being forbidden to complain. It's a miracle they didn't all go mad by Tuesday. The great monastic meltdowns. Yet plenty did. Medieval chroniclers, being the gossips they secretly were, recorded a surprising number of spiritual disturbances. That was the polite way of saying mental breakdowns. One Cistercian abbot described a monk who began barking like a dog during prayer. Another thought he was a saint and tried to bless the kitchen pots. A third spent months convinced that the devil lived under his bed. Sometimes the entire monastery caught the madness. In 1243, a group of monks in northern France claimed they were possessed. They screamed, convulsed, and accused each other of witchcraft. Inside a monastery, mind you, where women weren't even allowed. It got so bad that the bishop had to intervene. His solution? He ordered everyone to fast more and sleep less. Naturally, they made it worse. Holy visions or psychosis? It's easy to romanticize the Middle Ages as an age of faith and wonder, but the truth is many so-called holy visions probably had more to do with brain chemistry than divine revelation. Malnutrition, lack of sunlight, isolation, and chronic sleep loss are all perfect ingredients for hallucination. Modern neuroscientists could have made a fortune diagnosing monks if they'd been allowed inside the cloister. Take St. Catherine of Siena, for example. Though she wasn't a monk, her experiences were similar. Years of fasting, prayer, and self-denial that led to vivid visions. She described seeing Christ and the Virgin Mary almost daily. She also reported hearing voices and feeling physical pain from invisible sources. Today, psychiatrists might use words like psychotic episode or extreme fasting-induced delirium. Back then, they called her a saint. The problem of chastity, and then, of course, there was celibacy. For men who entered monasteries as teenagers, that vow came with consequences. Many joined at 14 or 15 before fully understanding what lifelong celibacy meant. By their 20s, the tension was unbearable. Some turned to self-punishment. Others broke their vows entirely. There are scattered records of monks secretly meeting women, or occasionally each other, in the gardens at night. When discovered, the punishments were severe. One abbot in the 11th century forced 2 monks to lie prostrate in the chapel for 3 days without food or water. Afterward, they were required to sleep in separate cells and avoid eye contact until death. That's one way to manage workplace relationships. The demons of the mind. In a world without psychiatry, everything strange had to be explained by spirits. If you felt empty or hopeless, it wasn't depression, it was a demon whispering doubt. If you couldn't focus during prayer, it wasn't ADHD, it was temptation. And if you suddenly screamed in the middle of Mass, well, you were possessed, obviously. The church actually had names for different mental afflictions. Accidia, for example, meant spiritual laziness or melancholy. It was the medieval version of burnout. Monks who suffered from it were often described as listless, sad, and unwilling to rise from their beds. Their treatment? More fasting. Because nothing cures existential despair like hunger. Life inside the walls. Daily life in a monastery looked peaceful from the outside, but inside it was a strange blend of routine and repression. Monks woke before dawn, prayed, ate a silent breakfast, worked in the fields or copied manuscripts, prayed again, ate lunch in silence, and then prayed some more. Talking was limited. Jokes were frowned upon. The only approved entertainment was reading religious texts, which, to be fair, were not known for their humor. Even laughter was considered suspicious. One abbot warned his monks that laughter opens the door to the devil. So naturally, everyone tried very hard not to smile. It was a world where joy was dangerous and silence was salvation. Over time, that kind of repression seeps into the mind. It's no wonder so many monks reported dark temptations or visions of horror. They were trapped inside their own heads, with nothing but the echoes of chanting to keep them company. The irony of piety. Ironically, the monks who suffered most were often the ones trying hardest to be holy. They followed every rule, fasted the longest, prayed the hardest, and burned out completely. Their minds simply broke under the pressure of perfection. One 14th century abbot wrote that his most devout brother fell into madness after 7 years of fasting and silence. He spent his final days wandering the garden, singing psalms to the birds before dying quietly in the snow. The chronicler noted, with grim serenity, that his faith never wavered, which of course is exactly what they would have said. A gentle conclusion for tonight. So why did so many medieval monks go insane? Because they were human, and they lived in a system that mistook suffering for sanctity and silence for peace. They wanted to be closer to God, but the road they chose was paved with hunger, loneliness, and exhaustion. Still, there's something hauntingly beautiful about their struggle. In those cold, candlelit halls, they searched for meaning in a world that made very little sense, something we're still doing in our own way 1,000 years later. So, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the distant echo of those old monastery bells, the soft rustle of robes, the quiet prayers whispered in the dark. And remember that even in their madness, those monks were just trying to find peace. The same peace you're searching for right now. Soft pause. When you're ready, we'll drift further into the stranger stories of medieval sanctity and the curious ways people tried to reach heaven by torturing themselves. But for now, rest easy, and I'll see you in part 2.